Mr. Jordi Pascual, Carbon City Scam Project is the title of his speech, and he is the city strategist at Circular Economy.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Good.
Brilliant. So, floor is mine?
Yep.
Okay, so hi, everyone. And indeed, I will talk about the circular economy and net zero, and more specifically on how circular economy, the organization I work for, we help cities in transitioning towards a circular economy while also achieving the climate targets. And I want to start with something that most of you probably know, which is that cities are centers of human activity. Cities are epicenter of our global system and supply chains. 50% of the global population lives in urban areas. 80% of global GDP is generated in cities. 2/3 of global energy is used in cities, and 70% of global resources are used in cities. And this confronts cities with many challenges that I want to summarize in these three. The first one already tries to connect the circular economy and climate change, because the impact that cities have that happen in the city, but also beyond the city's boundaries. And that's mostly driven by the consumption that happens in cities. And because of this fact, cities then are confronted with the fact that they need to take climate action because they are hotspots of consumption, and also they are very vulnerable to climate change. And then finally, the last challenge that we see is that all this change needs to be systemic. So we really need to bring together all the relevant stakeholders in cities to really make decisions, and these decisions need to be based on evidence. So now I want to talk about the circular economy as a solution for climate change and also as a climate mitigation strategy. Because all the research we do has shown that with business as usual, material extraction is projected to surpass between 170 gigatons and 184 gigatons by 2050. And in this graph, you can see the tendency going up in the past decades. And the current Lilian economy basically is driving us to consume over 100 billion tons of materials annually, which has tripled in the past 50 years, emitting over 59.1 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions, expected to hit 80 gigatons by 2032. And based on our research that we do with our Circularity Gap report, we have found that we currently are only 8.6% circular, which means that we waste over 91% of what we use. And the circular economy, what it provides is a tool to prosper within the planetary boundaries, basically, because it tries to mimic natural cycles in which waste doesn't exist. And this is the way we like to visualize it, with all these closed loops within supply chains where you see maintaining, reusing, remanufacturing, recycling, and biocycling, so that we can really capture the value of the resources and materials we use. And we really have an ambition and a vision for our system and economy, which is doubling circularity, which can bring a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 39%, reducing global resource extraction by 28%, and steer well below the 1.5 degree temperature that we all are aiming for. But to double circularity by 2032, we need to redesign our cities, because as I was telling before, these are epicenters of activity, of consumption, and a lot of the impact is actually happening there, and a lot of the solutions are also there. because cities are enablers. Cities are the focus of innovation, manufacturing, business activity, and therefore they have the potential to change the way we manage resources to achieve the benefits for people and the planet. But they can also benefit because the circular economy can really bring value creation, jobs, better equality, competitiveness in global markets, reduction of CO2, and also reduction, of course, of resource use. But how can we do that? At Circular Economy, we have been thinking about this question: how can cities really advance the circular economy agenda while also achieving their climate targets? And we came up with the solution we call the Circle Carbon Scan. And this approach basically tries to support cities on their journey towards circularity by helping them to link the circular agenda with the climate agenda, identify emission hotspots through data and evidence, measure emission reduction potential of circular economy interventions, inform local stakeholders on where and how to intervene, and create a common plan towards action. And this has mostly 4 phases in this process. In the first phase, we really try to what we call the baseline system flow analysis, where we map the urban metabolism of the city of resources. Then in a second step, once we have mapped all the resources of any given supply chain, we then convert this analysis into carbon footprint. So if we see all the materials being used in a city, what's the carbon footprint associated to all these materials which are flowing through the city because of the consumption that is happening in the city? Then in a third step, we look at the scenario analysis. So based on all these analyses, how can we actually start building scenarios? How could we improve the picture we are seeing? And then making an action plan to actually make it happen. And I wanted to share with you the first project we did with such an approach, which was in London. And this was the London's Food Carbon Scan we did last year, and we launched at COP26 in Glasgow. And this is just a representation of what I was just saying. There in London, we mapped the urban metabolism of the food sector in Greater London. And you can see here in the visual how all the green arrows are the food materials being imported to the city, flowing into processing, wholesale and retail, going into restaurants, but also households, and all the waste being generated on the way. And by looking at this picture, we were able to identify insights such as that 99% of food consumed by Londoners is imported into the city, and that over 1.3 million tons of food loss and waste are generated before reaching households, which is huge. But then, as I said before, in a second step, we also looked at the emissions. You can see the red arrow, which basically was trying to connect in each point of the supply chain how these materials that we are mapping have a carbon footprint associated, and how can we link that to emissions, which we call the consumption-based emissions. And for instance, we found out that 78% of Londoners' food-related consumption-based emissions occur outside of the city, which is huge, which is what I was saying before, that the impact of cities happen within the cities, but also beyond the city's boundaries. And by looking at this system that I was showing before, just this one, we were then able to draw these scenarios that I was explaining before by looking, for instance, what would happen, what if we reduce food loss and waste in London by 50%? That could decrease the food-related consumption-based emissions by 10%. And by doing this analysis, we actually end up in the conclusion that the circular economy could really help London to reduce almost 31% of the consumption-based emissions related to food, which is huge. And out of that, in a fourth step, with all these results, London is now capable to make an action plan in order to implement measures that can really capture all this potential for reducing emissions and impact. And an example is the Food Flagship Initiative, which is a 3-year partnership between ReLondon, the Greater London Authority, and Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which are basically defining and designing high impact and data-driven policy interventions to cut consumption-based emissions from food. So basically we are empowering London and other cities with data and evidence so that they can take action and make decisions to lower their carbon impact. And basically our ambition is to support cities in leveraging the circular economy to reduce their carbon footprint. And we have started that in London, and we have the ambition to replicate that in other cities and also in other sectors. And I believe, for instance, Milano did a great job in mapping the material flow analysis of food of the city. So it could, for instance, be a very good opportunity to then see how does that relate to carbon footprinting, and how can the circular economy help Milano to reduce the carbon impact. Thank you very much. That was it from my side. If you want to know more, you can contact me anytime you want.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you, Jordi. It was very interesting.